Mark. Good morning for you. Good afternoon for me.
I'm with
um,
you.
uh, yeah. So thanks for doing this interview. As I said before, it's all about sharing the skills with HR. Looking what other people did, sharing some fun projects. Maybe before we start, could you give us like a brief introduction of who you are and things you've been involved with?
Sure. So up until January this year, for the last 4 years, I was the head of employee experience at Airbnb. And so when I started there was about 650 employees. They were doing about 30 million nights a year. And when I left in January, they were up to about 4,000 employees and probably 250 million nights. So it was an exciting ride, and it was the kind of pioneer or engineering of this idea of moving from HR to employee experience. Before that, I'd spent about 3 years with Landor Associates, which is a global branding and design firm. And before that, I'd spent 2.5 years in France with Thompson, now called Technicolor. And prior to that, I'd spent many years in retail and apparel, HR with Levi's, Gap, Best Buy.
Yeah. All right. So you've been around, let's say.
Yeah.
And all right, that's good. And the first thing I always talk about in these interviews is the changing nature of the role of the HR function.
Mhm.
And I'd like to hear your opinion on that. HR is changing into this more strategic position, and perhaps if you're employee experience or HR analytics, even more technical position. And I feel like there's a lot of HR people that struggle with that change of role. Why do you think that is? How do you think a lot of people, go about changing their
Yeah.
skills?
Well, so my entire career, I've somewhat struggled being in HR because there's such a varied capability and understanding of the function. And from the very beginning, I would say I took the approach where I wanted to understand the business and figure out how I added value from the business forward, not from this notion of setting policies or rules or being the police. And I think it served me well. I think that building the relationships with the business leaders, understanding every aspect of the business, and then looking at what you can do to unleash the power and the creativity of employees is the right frame. But there's a lot of disciplines within HR. There's a lot of people who get a little intimidated by the business, and so that's not necessarily the way they've approached it. I would say in the last 4 years since I had started at Airbnb, there was a significant shift in HR, and to be honest, I just kind of stumbled on it. When I got to Airbnb, there was 4 people in what they called talent, about 25 in recruiting, and then a bunch of other people who were touching the employee but reporting into different places. And Brian Chesky, the CEO, said to me, I need you to figure out how to make sense of all this and figure out how you can have these people reporting into you, and you can figure out what you need to do. And I said to him, well, okay. And as we went through the list of people and groups, it was quite broad and expansive. And I said, well, let's figure out what to call this or how to explain it in a way that makes sense. And essentially I said, you have a group of people who are focused on our customers, which was both hosts and guests. Why don't we have this collection of people focused on our employees and call it employee experience, just like you call the other customer experience? And so it included traditional HR functions like talent and recruiting, but it also included things like facilities and food. In the beginning, it included real estate. And then this secret sauce at Airbnb, which is they call ground control, which are a group of people that focus on the culture and primarily internal communications, employee events, recognition, celebration, and then probably most importantly, the mission and the values. and not as cheerleaders, but as curators and ambassadors, and creating the container to be able to bring the culture to life through the employees. And so I'd say the two main things that I see as a shift in HR relative to this move towards employee experience is, one is org structure. It's, what is now or could be part of employee experience broader than traditional HR. But I would say more importantly is a mindset shift, which is that HR, employee experience, whatever you call it, whatever sits in it, needs to figure out how you're doing things with and for your employees rather than to them. And it's this idea of co-creation, of just like you do with your customers, you listen, you learn, you're there to help create better customer experiences. I do believe that's what HR, employee experience, and the leadership team should be doing with employees. And there's a huge connection, right? If you focus on what is the promise you're trying to deliver to your customer, and then you figure out how you bring that into what it is you do with and for your employees, then that ecosystem, that ability to understand the customer and deliver on the business needs will end up being a lot more present, and therefore your employees will be more energized and empowered and engaged and productive.
Yeah,
so,
and
sorry, that was a long answer.
no, long answers are good. I mean, and you, so did I understand this completely, that you renamed the entire HR function to employee experiences? There was no other HR function at Airbnb.
No, there was this small group of talent, which was 4 people. There was a recruiting, and all these people all these functions reported into different places. Ground control reported into another place, and so I basically said, let's bring it all together.
Yeah.
And figure out how we rename it, not to be cute and sexy, but to actually figure out a different way of thinking and a different way of
a different goal for HR, basically.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's what I meant. I meant at the end, of course, not when you came in. Yeah. Okay. And so can you give us maybe a concrete example of, a project that you did that focused around employee experience? And I'm particularly interested in the ones around mission and values. Because you mentioned, like, we made them come alive, and there was like these people that really had that responsibility of patrolling, but that's the wrong word, the culture. So how did that work? What's a concrete example of those people?
There's a couple around the mission and value. So when I arrived, Brian, Joe, and Nate define the type of company they wanted to build before they had their first employee, which I would highly recommend. And I do. I'm doing a bit of consulting now with early stage and startups. And it's so important to figure out, like, what do you want to be before you even start on that journey, so that you're building towards that, rather than all of a sudden being, whether it's 10 or 50 or 100 or 1,000, and going, yikes. We really didn't think about that. We just were hiring and growing. And so I think it's important to be deliberate and intentional around the type of company you want to be. And I think that starts with being super clear about your mission. What's your North Star? What do you wake up and want everyone to be thinking about as the ultimate dream or goal of the organization at a very high level? And then what are the values and or behaviors that you want to see each and every person in the company model, and the ways of working? And with those two things, you then create the culture, and you curate the culture, and the culture evolves, but it's based in this foundation. And so when I arrived, they had already crafted a mission and values. The mission was around feeling like you could be home anywhere, and there were 6 values. And the founders were essentially interviewing every single person, and really more on the value side and behaviors than on the technical side, assuming the manager understood and was going to take care of that. And then after 600 people or so, there was a acknowledgement that that might not be the best use of their time. So then they identified people that they were comfortable could do those interviews. And then over more time, there's now a nomination process, and there's probably 150, 200 people that are doing these core values interviews. The unique thing that Airbnb does is that there's essentially two types of interviews, and everyone goes through both, no questions asked. So there's the technical functional interviews that are done by the manager and the team and the colleagues that they would work with. But then separately and distinct, there are core values interviews, and they're done by people outside of the function. They don't see the CV of the individual. And in many cases, you don't even know what job they're interviewing for, because it doesn't really matter. Because the only thing that the core values interviewers are looking for is this person joining for the right reason? And at Airbnb, that would be, do they want to create a world where anyone can belong anywhere? Excuse me. Do they get excited about creating micro entrepreneurs in our hosts? Are they wanting to create local and authentic travel experiences? And if the answer is yes to all those, then they're coming for the right reason. If they want to make a shitload of money, or if they think it's the cool place to work, or they're looking for free food, those are not good reasons, and they will get screened out pretty quickly, because you can tell the mercenaries from the missionaries. And then there gets into a deeper conversation around the ways they work, the ways they think, to determine will they further the values and behaviors of the company. There's two of them, and if they both say yes, no problem. If they both say no, the person doesn't get hired, no questions asked, even if they're the smartest engineer from whatever big school they went to, or came from whatever hot company there is, because it's an and the company very much focuses on there needing to be both the technical and the mission and values. And then that goes through the first week of check-in or onboarding, where there's as much conversation about making sure people understand the mission and values and how it comes to life at the company. And then the performance management system most recently switched so that 50% of your assessment is on your results, or the what, and 50% of your results are on the how, or the values and behaviors. And so a couple things. One is that's all kind of led by the ground control team, which is responsible for bringing the mission and values to life. But it also shows how the values and the culture have been democratized, because there's 200 people who are responsible for sifting through these very qualified candidates to determine whether or not they will work there. And then even more so, there's a smaller group called the Core Values Council, which are people at all different levels and all over the world, and selected because they've been with the company for a while. They understand the values. They have a passion about making sure that the mission and values are used to make decisions. And they're consulted when there's any sort of big decision being made, whether it's a reorganization or a potential acquisition or a change in a significant benefit, because the leaders want to make sure that they're really double checking to what extent the important decisions are being made through the lens of the mission and values.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. But I think that as a new young company, and we've had the same, you can do that. You can identify your mission and especially the values of the kind of people you want to work with. Definitely in the beginning, as a founder, you have a lot of control over that. But the thing is that when you're an established company, I see a lot of established companies defining purposes, and it comes across a little fake, even awkward at times. Mm-hmm. So what's your experience with that? Do you have do's and don'ts for companies that want to create a purpose? Have you ever thought about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first one or two rules are, one is it has to be authentic. I mean, it has to be true to who you are and what you're doing. And two, it has to be believable and start with the CEO or the founder or the leader, and then emanate through the organization. And so this comes up a lot because I feel like my situation at Airbnb was one of the most, it was most satisfying, and it was also probably one of the easiest, because when your mission is to create a world where anyone can belong anywhere, and what you do does actually create that through your hosts and your guests, then as the head of employee experience, our mission was to create a company where people felt like they belong there. That is a beautiful thing, and it's pretty easy to do. I mean, it wasn't easy to do, but it was a real, it's like making a meal and having like all these great ingredients, and so it was easy to make a good meal because I had all these great ingredients. I've had a lot of conversation, particularly since I've left, as I've been doing this consulting with larger companies, whether they're financial services or insurance companies. And, it's like putting lipstick on a pig sometimes. Right?
That's exactly what it is.
And so there was one insurance company we were talking to, and, I was asking them, well, what's your mission? And it was like this long gobbledygook of lots of things.
Bringing happiness to the world. That's what it is usually, isn't it?
And I said, you need to figure out what it is in the heart that you're truly doing, and how do you get people to get excited by that? So for example, with the insurance company, it was like, if you truly believe that by people purchasing your insurance, they can live a life with less risk, with less risk, or they feel more comfortable or whatever, then say that, and then figure out how that's what your promise is to your customer, and therefore how do you then set up your employees to deliver on that promise. But it has to be relatable, and it has to be real, and it has to be authentic.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And the second thing that I often see in the like the bigger companies, when they have defined such a purpose, then they're not willing to commit to it, and they've defined this purpose and these values and whatever, and then they hire someone, and they knowingly hire them, knowing that they do not belong inside of this, these core values that they've set up and that kind of stuff. So that's something that I see a lot as well. They're not willing to put in the risk, definitely not in like these candidate-led markets, and to commit to the purpose. We're only going to hire people.
Yeah, what I've seen, a couple things that I've seen is, one is that this doesn't work for a few reasons. One is, so I had a meeting yesterday with a woman who's head of HR at a very large fast food company. And she was telling me that their mission was something about delicious, fast, and magical moments, or something like that. And so she was trying to convince the leadership that they needed to make sure that they were providing magical moments for their employees, so they could create these magical moments for their customers. But when she talked to the leaders about it, they said, no, I'm not giving the keys to the castle to the employees. We need to hold them accountable, and we can't just do everything they want us to do. And that's the misnomer, is people feel like co-creation or doing things with or for them means that you have to do everything they want to do. That's not right. What you should be doing is including them to say, how do we help you to deliver on what it is we're promising our customers? Not, how do I just give you whatever you want or pay you more money or whatever. And so I think there's a fear of, if I ask them, they're going to tell me things, and then I don't want to do that. But as you learn in school, ask the question in a way that you don't get an answer that you don't know what to do with. So the question should be framed based on, how can I set you up for success to deliver on the promise we're giving to our customers, not what do you need, or what can I do for you, right? And the other thing, going back to your first question relative to HR, is I think a lot of people in HR are fearful that right now they have the power, and they get to make the decisions, and they decide what vendor they're going to use, or they decide what the program is going to be. And they don't want to give that up, whether it's to other business leaders or to the employees. But I think when you do that, you end up It's like a company that makes a bunch of product but hasn't done any sort of focus groups or listened to what sold last season. And Lord knows what's going to happen when you put that product to market, because you haven't included the people who you're delivering it for.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of parallels with, customer centricity, employee centricity. I feel also in saying no, because you mentioned before that if you introduce a purpose or you introduce these values and you just play into the employee's hands all the time and you're not
Yeah.
afraid to say no, you're not
Yeah.
credible, and it helps your credibility and it helps you implement it, ironically, when you say no. So sometimes saying no makes you more customer, or in this case, employee centric.
Yeah.
And that's what we see a lot, is that they do everything for the employee because they want to be employee centric.
Yeah.
Sometimes you've just got the wrong employee, right? That's an important difference. So, Mark, another thing I'm very curious about is when you read about these big tech companies, is that they have this very specific way of thinking about payments, right? And so what Google says, Laszlo Book, for example, what he says is, I want to pay unfairly, because when you look at the same job, definitely if it's a complex technical job, a same person can be 8 times more efficient than another person in the same role with the same background, the same resume, whatever. So we pay him 8 times or her 8 times more. So
Mm-hmm.
is that the philosophy of Airbnb as well, or how did you guys go about that?
Well, I mean, so I think any company you talk to would say that they want to pay for performance. I think what you have is different companies defining what that looks like, and to some extent, it's been made even more challenging because a lot of companies are doing away with ratings, performance ratings, and so then that makes it even more difficult to determine. I mean, there's other ways you can determine who's performing and who's not performing, um, but it's become quite difficult and challenging. So I would say at Airbnb, most tech companies, you are trying to pay either at or above market, and you have a mix that you decide is the way you want to approach things. And some companies go heavy on cash. Not necessarily startups or those that have valuable equity. They go heavy on equity for a couple of reasons. One is they can't afford the cash, and two is they want people to be invested in the company and they want them to win if the company wins. So there's the whole idea of mix, but then looking at differentiating between, also start with differentiating between functions. I would say at most tech companies, because of the market, the range of someone at the same level, their comp and their equity is much higher if you're in a tech role than if you're in a not tech role. And that's just because that's what the market dictates. And because in tech, the organizations, product management, engineering, UX, UI design, data science, they're the core of the company. And the labor market is much tighter. And we had this conversation. One great engineer who solves a CX problem could save you thousands of customer experience agents. So there is a value that they provide that is justifying the higher pay. I would say within a function that you have to be careful about how you differentiate pay. You have to be able to, I think, justify it. And so if you are heavily metrics and you can determine that one engineer is delivering at a much higher rate or has delivered more value, then I think you could then fairly determine that they should get paid more than the other. I think more recently, there's a lot of appropriate concern and attention towards how to pay in a way that's unbiased. And that's, whether it's gender based or it's race based, because there's been a lot of challenges and it's been very unfair how underestimated, underrepresented people have been paid. And so I think that needs to be considered in any pay practice to ensure that those biases are taken out and that the approach can be considered and is a fair way of considering the approach to compensation.
And what metrics would you use, or maybe even did you use, for such decisions? Because I've not seen a lot of examples that objectively identify, the difference in performance definitely in the same role of a person.
Yeah. Well, again, as I mentioned earlier, when I left Airbnb, there was a move to, just like was the case at interview and selection, with performance assessments, there was a move to look at 50% of the person's rating based on the results, or the what, and 50% based on the how or the behaviors. And so there were ways in which both of those aspects were set as either goals or expectations. And then there is a scale to what extent you did or didn't meet those expectations. So that was the way that at least Airbnb was trying to look at doing this fairly. There was a couple other things that that we did that was trying to eliminate bias. So for example, instead of having a year-end review, there were 2 6-month reviews, and then those ratings were combined to look at your annual review. And what that did was eliminate the recency bias, because a lot of what happens in an annual review is that you only remember what happened in the last few months. And so the performance and behaviors of the first 6 months get lost. And then the second thing was that we eliminated self-ratings, because the data would tell you that women in particular rate themselves lower than men. And if they don't rate themselves at a higher rating, then whoever their boss is typically wouldn't give them the higher rating, even if they thought that they were a higher performer. And so those are a couple ways in which, and then the third thing we did was we implemented more 360 feedback. So you were getting feedback not just from your manager, but from your colleagues and the coworkers that you worked with. So more data points meant that there was more accuracy in getting the feedback on your results and behaviors. So those are 3 things that that they did to try and eliminate bias and to create more fairness in the process.
Yeah, sure. And so what I've seen work here in Europe, so I'm quite curious what your opinion is on that, is that people just set out a fixed budget in terms of, salary raises, depending on your, experience and maybe even job title, very simple stuff. Make it, go to the background, and they make an exception for like the 5% top and low performers, because it seems when you look at the research that it's those 5% that makes like 70% of the difference in performance. So have you seen that work on your side of the ocean?
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. So typically what we would look at was a budget that was, if it was a 5 scale rating, someone who got a 1 got a 0% increase. Someone who got a 2 would rarely get 1 unless they were on a trajectory forward. And then 3, 4, and 5, we looked at 2 things. We looked at the position and the range, because there was pay ranges, and then we looked at their performance rating. And there was then, there was guidance that was put out based on those 2 factors. But the increase of a 3 would be maybe 1x, and the increase of a 5 would be 3x. And so your budget was heavily skewed towards your highest performers, and didn't use a bell curve, but the budget was done so that, I'm going to make it up, but maybe 10% of your people only were in a 5 range. So if you gave more people, then you had less money to go around for your top performers, and you weren't using your budget in a thoughtful way. So yeah, I completely agree that once you differentiate performance, then you need to also differentiate the pay so that the higher performer gets the higher percentage of increase.
Yeah, and I feel like there's a lot of systems out there right now that actually also, take into account maybe fewer metrics and focus on identifying those high potentials and doing, average and standard stuff for most of the other people. But
you used a word that I think you need to be careful, and this is also something that happens in the EX HR conversations, is there's always a question of whether your performance management system and your pay for performance is based on performance or potential.
yeah,
Typically, potential is something you talk about relative to um, succession planning and someone's next role and development. And in some companies that I've worked at, you would use you would use pay or compensation based on performance, and you might use equity based on performance and potential, because equity is a longer term play. And so there's different ways you use different levers to look at different factors.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
Yeah.
What I should have said is value, right?
Yeah.
Instead of performance. So you're absolutely right. So 100% agree. So maybe let's switch to the future of HR once more, and let's circle back to the beginning of the conversation.
Okay.
What do you think HR has in store in the coming years? What are most exciting changes to come in HR for you personally?
So I'd say a couple things. One we talked about, which is this idea of thinking about the employee experience and thinking about both what's in HR and also shifting the mindset to be much more around design thinking or co-creation. That I think that's a huge one. I think the second one, and in that, I think therefore the roles of HR shift a bit. I mean, I did some work with an organization here in the States, and they came up with 4 kind of major roles of HR going forward. And one of them, which was this idea of cultural ambassador and community advocate. And we haven't really talked about the community side of things, but part of employee experience, what I introduced was a whole idea of social impact and the role that the company and in particularly employees could play in giving back. And so we introduced 4 hours of volunteer time a month, and then that evolved into having volunteerism as part of the check-in or onboarding process to show the company's commitment to giving back and also to creating connection and belonging of the people in the cohort that we're starting, but also connection to the communities in which they operate. And then it evolved even further into the fact that the company now 1 day or 1 week a year all goes out together and volunteers, and at the holiday time, instead of having holiday parties now, teams go out and volunteer to those underserved or who are in need. And then even introduced idea of giving money to donate at years of service rather than a watch or a bottle of champagne or something. So that's really involved in, I think, the younger generation and also the idea of purpose at work is driving towards that idea of community advocate or social impact. And then I think also the use of both data and the use of technology are critical to the future. So data helps you to figure out the return on investment of what you're doing. It helps you to understand better what's going on with your employee base to make more informed decisions. And so I think the use of employee engagement surveys and both quantitative and qualitative, and then the use of retention, turnover, performance, all that kind of data. And so we struggled at the beginning because we didn't have that within the EX function. But then when we asked for help from the data science team, it was amazing how much their expertise came to bear in helping us to be much more thoughtful. And on the technology side, I've had many conversations around artificial intelligence and technology and taking people's jobs. And I think we should welcome it, because there's so many things that could be repeatable and could be much better done through technology, whether it's screening CVs or whether it's analyzing the engagement score surveys, or doing, the work of using technology to help with benefits questions or whatever. Get rid of the transactional things where people don't add value, and be able to step up to more value added, more strategic, more interesting, more people oriented activities. So I'd say I think those are the merging things people should be embracing and exploring and focusing on shifting towards.
Yeah, that makes sense. Actually, you triggered me when you said that the data science team came in and that they, made you change your perspective about certain things, that they taught you certain things. Can you give us some examples of insights that they, with their expertise, could give an HR team or an
Sure.
experience?
Yeah. So the first place they really focused on was through the recruiting process.
Oh yeah.
Because a couple of years ago, Airbnb had 260,000 CVs submitted for less than 1,000 jobs. So trying to make sense of that in a way that was both humanistic to the applicants, but also to make good decisions, really necessitated the ability to use data and analytics to be more thoughtful. And so they were really helpful, and they were looking at how many people interviewed each of these folks, and what was the quality of those interviews, and how did the ratings correlate to then their performance, a year later. And there was just a lot of ways in which their data and analytics helped us to look at reframing either the number of people involved in the interviews and or the questions we were asking, or what to listen for, or helping us to look at how we might use technology to do some of the screening, which might be more productive than having a human do that.
Did you tie back what they or what you recorded in those interviews to later performance? Did you make some conclusions on that?
Yeah, so that was part of the analysis that they did with us. Mm-hmm.
Okay, and was there any fun stuff that you concluded by chance? Maybe interview questions that everyone asks and that don't make any sense, for example?
Well, they helped us both in looking at finding the right people that could be productive in their roles. And some of it was technical, and some of it was behavioral, and some of it was also making sure we were not overlooking people that may not be your typical hire, and also to make sure we eliminated bias out of the process. There were many things that came out of the use of the data science team.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, maybe one final question on my end, Mark. What if I'm an HR manager and I don't have a lot of experience with product management and that kind of stuff, but I do want to start becoming, the employee experience advocate, working for and with employees instead of, the old way of thinking? Where do I start?
Well, what I would recommend is that you start with either looking at something that you do and determining to what extent it is well appreciated and successfully being utilized. So you could say, for example, the engagement survey that you use. And so bringing people in at different levels of the organization, different functions, different countries, and getting their feedback on this mechanism or this program or this process that they're using, and finding out from them what's working, what's not working. And then from that, determining to what extent you have something that you want to continue with. And if not, then looking at how you might leverage that group or maybe a smaller group to help you to identify what would be a better solution or what would be a better outcome, and then working with them on what that solution might be. So if you can't reimagine or reinvent the whole function, then I would say just start to think about a project or a situation where you can play with this idea of co-creation. I mean, one of the simplest things that we did was we were moving into a new building, and we did a survey with all the employees and got them to help us to understand, how do you like to work? You know, do you like to sit? Do you like to stand? Do you like having a desk, or would you prefer to have, you know, a place where you could roam? I mean, all of those kind of, and just asking the questions and then listening and then being inclusive around what you do with that information, I think is a great way to start and get comfortable with this shift towards a different way of HR thinking and behaving.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And how do you feel about the functional divide that HR has? You know, you have a talent manager, and then you have someone responsible for the performance management process, for the leadership training, for what have you. Do you feel like that should all become like one job title, just an HR person, and then do projects depending on what's needed most in the business? Or do you feel like HR functions still have their use?
No, I mean, I think it's very helpful to have expertise in whatever you call them, centers of excellence. And those people bring a lot of important value to the organization, because I think kind of the opposite is sometimes what are called generalists or talent partners or business partners, they're so thin in all of those disciplines that they aren't really adding that much value. And so I think there's a way that everyone can work well together if, first of all, everyone has the same perspective, which is that we're here to be working with and for, and that we're here to help the employees get set up to deliver on the customer promise. And then it's a matter of then how do those different parts of the organization function and work. I mean, you could set it up so your centers of excellence also have account managers or people who are familiar with and have relationships with and understand different parts of the business, so that there's representation of the customer that you're trying to solve challenges with and for. So I do think the old model doesn't necessarily work, because there was always a conflict between the people that were creating programs and the people who were nestled in the business. Sometimes the HR business partners went native and they just did and said whatever their clients wanted them to do, and they weren't being very thoughtful, and they didn't necessarily have the expertise to be able to deliver some of the new programs and or to customize them for the businesses they were supporting. So I think it still has to be this whole ecosystem. It just needs to be a mind shift around how they're looking at what they're doing and how they work together.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. The only reason I ask is because in agile development, everyone has their own expertise, obviously, and you would prefer everyone, you know, using their expertise as much as possible. But if priority dictates otherwise, we're all going to work on a mobile app, even though that's not your expertise. And that's kind of the shift I see in HR as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a little, I've been doing a lot of comparing employee experience or HR to the customer experience. So if you thought about the steps you go through when you're flying, right? And you have reservations, and then you have the gate agent, and then you have the pilot and the flight attendants and the baggage claim. If they all did things and it wasn't coordinated, your experience would be so awful. And so having that customer journey is what ties it all together. And it's got to be the same thing with the employee journey, but it can't be that everyone works in their own piece and part on an assembly line without coming together and talking about what the whole experience looks like. So I think there's a lot to learn from how we look at what we do with the customers to kind of reinvent and reimagine how we work in HR employee experience.
Yeah, definitely. All right, good. Some very strong takeaways. Mark, thank you very much for having this interview. And we'll talk soon, I guess.
Pleasure.
Thank
Have a
you.
good weekend. Yeah.
Yeah, you too.
Mhm.